Last time around I didn't take questions, not the best decision I think I've ever made. And I'm glad to take them today, but I think perhaps it would be better if we did the package at the end of the talk rather than at the beginning. I did talk to you about Chapelle, the classic of the French cathedrals, that was really the beginning of a family of them. We talked about the question of east to west, west to east, and I described to you John James' view that the thing was entirely a question not of time but of teams, that the different decisions were made according to the taste and the practice of the different teams. And so these differences in the buttresses are not a question of difference in dating. He said it was done more or less all at once, with the team that did those nave flyers coming back to do this, what I think is a beautiful western rose. We were able to wander around that summer, and I showed you some slides from the North Tower that give a sense, I think, of the scale of the place better than those from below, looking out over the town. We talked about the subtle transition from square to octagon in the southern tower, the early one, managed by these corner turrets. And I took you through a kind of tour of the town and the cathedral. We started at the river, crossed the bridge, and went up to the west facade, and from there through these portals with their column-like figures marking the jambs, the tympanum above, Christ in majesty and judgment, the dearest of the Christ figures to me. We pass the tympanum in judgment with our friends, my friends, accompanying us, ushering us into the space. The nave, the three-part elevation, the large clear story with two lancets in the rows, the wheel windows at the crossing. And I said that this was a classic for many reasons. One of them was its removal from Paris to the southwest. That has shielded it from the damage of wars that typically, once they have reached Paris, have stopped. The geography of Reims Cathedral was not so fortunate. It was shelled for 2 years, from 1916 to 1918, and was terribly, terribly damaged at the end of the war, looking halt. But this misfortune told us something as well. There was a positive element to all the terrible damage, because it showed us a system of construction that we hadn't known until this told us about it. Each stone is numbered for its location, so that a stone, for instance, a third of the way up that pier on the left would be marked third course, pier left, arcade, whatever. So that the entire thing really was a kind of assemblage by number. All the work done in the lodge, and then the pieces arriving pretty much finished on site and simply put together by location, all of it sorted out beforehand, which lends yet another understanding to the processes of the lodge and the construction of the buildings. Reims was restored. There was originally a thought of keeping it as rubble to remind us of the war and of history, and then a proposal to tear the whole thing down since it was in such terrible shape. But those decisions were countermanded by ultimately a desire to restore, and restore it was. This was done with a very large donation from John Rockefeller. I've not been able to find the exact figure or percentage, but 38% somehow is lodged in my memory, and I think that may be it. So dominant was his donation that this avenue that on which the camera is located is John Rockefeller, Rue John Rockefeller. Reims is important for several reasons. It's important to our story for many reasons. It is the coronation church for French kings, and to that end it has this quite lovely small chapel to the southeast of the east end. Lovely little building in its own right. Here the king-to-be would have been at prayer and summoned them to the church for coronation. He would have passed a quite lovely east end. The east end of Reims is really a very fine and very appealing piece of work. The tall windows here you can see repeat the two lancets and rows of Chartres, but they are put within a pointed rather than a round clerestory arch. And here you see a fact that we're going to talk about a little later, which is that all of the stuff around the rows is glazed. It's the pointed arch is in glass right up to the top of the thing and to the sides of the rows where it meets the lancets below. The flyers, rather oddly, are lower, are below at the meeting point, below the outer range of flyers, and I've never understood why that is so, nor has anyone explained it to me, but it is a feature of Reims, one of the aspects of what I think is in so many ways such a beautiful handling of that east end. And the same is true of its facade. I suppose I could say, Chartres, wonderful though it is, that this is perhaps the most elegant, the most beautiful of the French facades. A gorgeous thing. It derives in part from Laon that we have seen. The Laon towers with their oxen, I think, were the inspiration for the turning of the corners of these upper towers. Beautiful organization, the great rows there above the three portals, which unlike Chartres, are an indication of the central and side aisles within. There is also here, and this is again a feature that is important at Reims, you'll see that the tympanum that at Chartres was Christ in Judgment, here is glazed as well in stained glass. That last bit of the facade that was solid material here also is a colored glass feature. Reims is also important for the sequence of builders whom we know by name. The first that was listed in the piece on the floor was Jean d'Orbais, then Jean Le Loup, Jean the Wolf. I don't know where that name came from, no one's explained it, but such was his name. Then Bernard de Soissons, a nearby site that also has its own cathedral, and finally Gaucher de Reims. And the first three, we know from John's work, these teams typically stayed for about 3 years. They average about that duration at any one site, and then they move on. And that was true of the first three here. They stayed for about 3 years each. And in 2020, we have Gaucher de Reims, a local man, who is here for 35 years as the teams come and go. This is, I think, as reasonable a place as any to say that this is the beginning of the profession of architecture, in which the person indicated as in charge of the thing is responsible to the site and not to a Masonic team. So Gaucher de Reims, perhaps the first European architect that we can call by that term. The site is important also because, as a consequence of its use as a coronation church, it has an extraordinarily long nave. 9 bays here instead of the 7 at Chartres and at Amiens to follow. And it's an elegant plan, I think. Just as a pattern on the screen, it seems to me a beautiful design, lovely design. 9 bays in the long nave. This would have been, of course, useful not only for the coronation, but also it would give the bishop a wonderful setting for his masses as he proceeded from entry up to the altar. And then the lovely ring of chapels, double ambulatory, well not double, but deep chapels occupying the outer zone. Beautiful plan, lovely plan. And in section, you see we move from grandeur to grandeur. Our Paris at the far left, then Chartres, and the third one is Reims. The nave arcade taller still, the clerestory about the same size as Chartres, and a tall triforium between them. The Chartres scheme of 2 lancets and a rose in the clerestory repeats here. And here you see the loveliness of that glazed tympanum at the entry, complementing the rose and the range of glass above. It's a beautiful scene, beautiful building. The triforium, the lancets, the rose. And I show you this as a reminder that these buildings were not completed. The drawing at the left is Reims as it was intended. And as you see, it's quite different. The 7 spires that were intended, none of them built. Amiens, 1220, just as we have the date of an architect at Reims, this has begun. And tall, I suppose, is the key word for Amiens. It's a building in which the vertical is absolutely celebrated. And why am I going backward? Because I pushed the wrong button. It's not happening. Amiens. The facade here, I think, is not the equal of Reims. It doesn't have quite that sense of unity. The towers don't match. I don't know why that is, and we'll find it again at a couple of sites. But the rose you see here is small and high, and that gives you a clue about the proportion of the interior, because the rose, of course, sits at the top of the vaulting, and that tremendous vertical of the elements from the central portal up to the rose is the proportion of the interior vaulting. It had to be filled in somehow, and the designer here has put that row of that open arcade above the portals. But the rose it seems to me less nicely integrated than at Reims, but it has to be there. The designer, once he decided on his proportions, had no choice. You see why I use the word tall. These chapels, their windows. Again, the lancets and rose idea, but how attenuated. Yeah. We know the architect, and he slipped my mind. He's on your sheet. Who is he? Robert de Luzarche, yes, thank you. Robert de Luzarche was the one who set this down. And again, at the site for a long period of time. We can again call him the architect and not the master mason. Deep, rich portals. And the plan of not the lengthy nave of Reims, but I think again a beautiful plan. And this is the one that I mentioned to you early on as seeming almost impossible to build. You look at the size of those supporting elements, and those of you here who are in building or engineering, I would hesitate to do that in reinforced concrete. So delicate are the elements that support this piece of masonry. Delicate, astonishingly so. Pinpoints the support. And you might remember that I said the forces have to come down within the middle third of those tiny, tiny points of support. 141 feet to the top of the vaulting. Chapelle was 121, Reims 130 something. This is 141 feet. The buttresses here open as a kind of arcade. And it now is the far right view of of a couple of bays. And you see how tall, the tallness of those lancets in the first story that are themselves lancets in a rose. This, the heritage of the Grand Vault and the Colosseum. We've come a long way, haven't we? Isn't that gorgeous? I just have to say so. I love it so. And here are these piers, so thin, so delicate. The precision of it, the vision of it, the imagination. This is Beauvais, and this is the last of the ones I'm going to be showing you of the cathedrals. This is only the transepts and the choir. It reaches for an even greater height, 164 feet to the vaulting, and you can see that the inner aisle is high, because you can see there just about the middle of things that there's a second clerestory, very stout, very short, that opens to the inner of the five aisles. This collapsed twice, and there were a lot of interpretations of the thing. It was pride goeth before a fall and all this sort of thing, but we found more recently that it was a change in the groundwater that undermined the foundations. And without that, this amazing height was feasible, workable. Astonishing, right? Astonishing. Now, I'm going to take you to a very, very different site. Bourges. I didn't put this in your outline, and I should have. Bourges. This was begun in 1195, so it's almost exactly contemporary with Chapelle. And it's a very, very different sort of thing. It's well south of Paris. I wasn't able to find the exact mileage, but I said about 100 miles south. It had been the capital of the province of Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, and as such, it was a major effort in a very different understanding of what the Gothic might be. 5 great portals rather than 3, leading to 5 great aisles. A grand facade. This is a facade that means to tell you that it's an important building. Grand, impressive facade. Within a rather lovely town, actually. It has a great deal of half-timbering houses that are unique for their number and the community that they established. But it's different not only in its 5 portal facade, its 5 bays, but in its totality. There are no transepts. Just these little porches. That's all there is of the cross plan. It's not that tall. Very simple plan, 5 great aisles. We're back now to sexpartite vaulting. And again, this is contemporary with Chartres. Again, I would call your attention to the tininess of the supporting system. All these little points of support. And I'd say it again, I can't imagine doing this in reinforced concrete today. In section, it's unique as well. As you see here, the first side aisle is high and has its own clerestory. And the flyers are very rigged. They're at quite a steep angle compared to the Chartrain school. This has been shown by engineering analysis to be the equivalent, the most efficient of the Gothic systems. This is the one that's working most efficiently with that steeper rig and the tiers of buttresses that support that high sexpartite vaulting and the high inner aisle. And this yields, of course, a very different kind of interior volume, one in which that nave arcade is very high, very tall. Quite a different spatial feel from the Chartrain school we've seen. There are those who would see this as an alternate Gothic, but it has almost no progeny. It stands almost alone as an example of this. Now, we return to our old friend. You remember Saint-Denis? This is one of a number of examples of the latest period that we're going to be talking about in France, the 1250s, the end of the wine. The wine is gone, the money is gone, but so are the sites. By this date, almost every diocese in France has rebuilt in this new style. Such was its appeal. It has led to the rebuilding of the bishoprics of France virtually throughout. And by this stage, it has become something rather different. Way down at the end there, just below the middle of this image, is the ring of little chapels that we talked about as the beginning of it all. They're way down there. Above them, you see that the triforium is glazed. It's in glass. This happened first at Amiens, and I should have mentioned it there. The side aisles, instead of being roofed with a shed roof, are roofed with a pyramidal shape so that where they meet the body of the building, they are down at the base of the triforium, and the triforium then can be glazed, the last bit of solid surface of the scheme. And you'll notice here, and I think the next slide will show it well. Yes. Well, I have one more, I think, that will show it even better. Here we're looking at the choir, clearly, looking back toward the little ring of Suger's chapels, and above them the glazed triforium and the upper vaulting. Yes, this is one I wanted to show you, or perhaps the earlier one is better. You see that these piers are no longer columns. I don't know whether you can remember back to Chartres, we had a column with attached shafts, but the column was totally evident. It isn't here anymore. What has happened to it? It has become that whole series of shafts, each one of which leads to an arch above. The entire system of the vaulting at Saint-Denis can be read through the shafts of the piers. This is a carrying out of an objective that I described to you when we started this series. That is, that a system could be developed in which a unity and order could subsume and perhaps even express ultimate variety. Here, with the nave arcade, the piers of Saint-Denis, we have reached a point at which the entire system can accept all kinds of variety. Look at the complexity of this, and yet the order that utterly pervades every bit, every piece, every pier, every stone. Here, the late Gothic, the end of the Y in France. This is the period also that southern transept at Notre Dame that faces the Seine. That beautiful transept is the cousin to this, and about the same time, about the same day. And this was the time of smaller buildings. You will all know this, I suspect you all know. This is La Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Tiny building. The crown of thorns, supposedly the relic that is here. Someone once pointed out that late Roman times seemed to be doing the medieval era a favor in divvying up so many of the different relics that could be distributed throughout the various bishoprics of France. This is the crown of thorns. We know here the architects Pierre de Montreuil and Thomas Cormont. Pierre de Montreuil, the lower reaches of the building, and Thomas, the upper bits, the vaulting. It's of 2 stories. The second floor was directly connected to the palace domains, and so could be accessed by the king most easily. You see here the 2 stories, the upper one with that flamboyant rose. And what is it? Look at those buttresses that line the side of it. They're very deep. They're quite stiff, and they are connected one to the other across the building by the roof trusses, so that forms a kind of lock system to support and carry. What's happening? Someone's phone. Can you turn it out? There we go. Please. The lower floor of La Sainte-Chapelle, quite ornamented, quite colored. The arching here, the spring point is the very base of the arches. As you see, this is a room that is quite low. And at the corners of it are the stairs that lead up to the upper chamber. And this, it seems to me, if there is a weakness in La Sainte-Chapelle, it's this, because I think this is a space that desperately wants to be entered on axis. I don't like this corner entrance to this glorious space. The canopy over the altar, you can see that even it has its own vaulting system. Look up under the canopy, and there is its own vaulting. And then there is the totality. If the objective of the Gothic early on was a cage of light and glass and order and complexity and expression, structure, remnant, heritage of the groin vault, exploration of all it can do, this is a lovely, lovely late example of it. Flamboyant, we still have that font. Flamboyant, flame-like, characteristic of the late eggs. We've gone through a lot of material today. I've gone through it rather quickly because I wanted to save considerable time for discussion, because I think you may have quite a bit at this point. We leave France. This royal throne of kings, this scepter dial, this earth, this realm, this England. We go to England here. This is a painting by John Constable of Salisbury Cathedral. It's a building I despise, and I'll tell you why next week. But we also get to talk about Wells, which is a building I love, and I'll tell you about that also. And with that, I'm open to a sizable session of questions. I'd love to chat with you about whatever is on your minds.
If you have any questions, we have two people to handle the microphones. Someone here.
I have a question about the earlier churches which had the big arches coming down on the side. Were those built when the church was built, or were they added to give strength?
I assume you're talking about the flying buttresses?
Yeah.
At Rome and at Paris, they were added. They were not part of the original design at either site. But Chartres was the first to realize that they had a potential for shaping the design in themselves. And so Chartres is the first real instance of their intended use from the beginning.
Oh, okay.
So they are a part of the Chartrean design, that whole family, right from the outset. And they yield, of course, the opportunity for that very large clerestory that is utterly different from Paris.
In the early churches, did they begin to give way, or did they?
At Notre Dame, Paris, in the building of the nave, the masonry began to show cracks in the outer surfaces, which was telling the builders that it was failing. And at that point, the flyers were put in as an expedient prop. Yeah. The later flyers that we see now are a century later. They come from the period of this building, and that dramatic reach right across both side aisles is a late remodeling when Chartres obviously shone much brighter than Paris, and Paris had to do something about it. That was when that Paris story was rebuilt, and those grand flyers that you see now were put in place.
Question over here.
Great questions over here.
Grant, after your last talk, I had a question which may be totally irrelevant, so you don't have to answer it, but the thought that I had was, what a tremendous difference there is between what you've shown us today and what I saw when I looked at some of the early places of worship in Ireland. Christianity came to Ireland about the 8th century, and essentially the places of worship were brick pub-tents with no windows, whatever. Do you have any thoughts about how you get from that roughly 8th or 9th century pittance of a building to the sorts of things that you're talking about in this series?
The Irish sites, the Irish story is a lovely one in itself. The Skellig Islands were the last outpost of the monasteries that were pushed westward, and I've always thought it was a rather dramatic moment. Those islands, as the monks looked westward, must have seemed the end of the world. The Skelligs off the west coast of Ireland, and they, so far as we know, lived, as you said, in stone huts. The later work in Ireland, I know less about its vaulting, its upper work, because much of it is gone. Most of the Irish sites are in ruins, as I imagine you know. But the, what is it, Glendalough? St. Kevin's Monastery. The St. Kevin's Chapel is a tiny building with openings, but you'd hardly call them windows. Where we get from that to what I've shown you is by way of the Romanesque, and on the continent and in England, I don't know of any intermediate work in Ireland. I don't know Ireland that well, but I know it to some extent. The evolution through the Romanesque, Roman-like as it means, to the Gothic is what I've tried to take you through in this series of talks, and we'll talk about it more in England as well, as you know. I'm not sure what to add to that. The evolution was by trial and error, the props at Notre Dame, Paris, the attempts at height, the pointed arch, and its release of the problem of dimensions of the vaulting as related to its height. I've tried to talk you through that. I find it a lovely story, and I've enjoyed talking to you about it, but I don't know what more. Is there something more I can say to answer your question? Have I answered it at all?
Grant?
Yeah.
I have one here.
Yeah.
Just like buildings, just like us, buildings need good bones or they tend to fall down.
Yes, indeed.
Was the master builder charged with the building or designing the bones of the structure, and then underlings or designed all the little details that went into that, or was the master in charge of the entire thing?
That's a nice question, which is a speaker's way of saying that he needs a little time to think up an answer. The lodges, I don't know what the hierarchy was in the lodges. I only know that it was there that the design was done in all of its aspects. Prompted, of course, by some issues that you brought up, the idea of the plan as a cross, although it doesn't obtain at Bourges, as we've seen. But the lodges would have signed on to build the building, and that meant everything. That meant laying the first courses of the actual structure. It meant putting people on such things as the sculpture work at the tympanum of Chartres. What the hierarchy was, we don't know. We know that the masons who did the tympana were maçons libres, free masons, which meant that they worked the stone that was free of faults, the finest of the quarries. I don't think I can detail it much more than that, and I don't know that it's possible to do so. There's a book on your reading list, The Stones of the Abbey, that is a wonderful taking of you into the building of a Romanesque Citeaux, the Abbey family of Citeaux. We decided it was Le Tournai, I think, that was being built. And it will take you into a mason working on a site, but he's not doing a tympanum, he's doing the upper foundations, as I remember it. That's a long but not very satisfactory answer to your question. I don't know how to do it better. Yeah. Does that help at all?
Yep.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Hello.
I have two quick questions, I think. The first is, we don't hear much about excavation for the foundations, and I'm curious about that. And then secondly, I just was wondering, the treatment of this seems to be unusual.
The what?
The treatment, the
Yes.
decoration, and I'm just wondering whether that's paint or tile or what.
I thought I knew a lot about this stuff, but I don't know an answer to that one. I think it's paintwork. And there was, as has been painfully recalled at Chartres and other sites, there was painting done on these buildings. The portals of Amiens were painted quite richly, we know that. Quite a number of colors, almost garish. But I think the interiors were rarely done to this extent. This is a small building and a lot of money poured into it directly from the crown. It didn't depend on a market or donations. The crown simply put out the dollars. So it is quite richly done. I don't think it's quite typical. One thing I would call your attention to, I've done so many times in these lectures, is the exactness of it. It's built so precisely, so exacting. In some ways, this was easy. Establishing a true vertical in a project like this is no problem at all. You drop a plumb line, and there it is. And it can go 160 feet as well as 25 or 30. But building to that exactness is another matter. It's not as simple as a plumb line. I have tried to explain to you in this course how these buildings were built. And in the end, I have to say, I don't understand how they did it. I don't know how they did it. It astonishes me, even knowing what I know. And I've studied this stuff for 70 years and more now, and yet I still remain astonished.
And the foundations?
Oh, the foundations. I lost track of your first question. The foundations in France are often reworkings of earlier foundations. At Chartres, entirely new foundations were laid, but they were laid immediately contiguous to those of the prior church. At Amiens, I think they are mostly new, but not entirely, and at Reims, there was a smaller church by far, so the new foundations would have extended the building very considerably. In England, we'll see that they tried to use earlier foundations, sometimes unwisely. The tower at York Minster the foundations, can you imagine, had to be rebuilt at York Minster at the tower. Piers 16 feet on a side. that had to have new foundations under the innumerable tons of masonry. I'll talk to you a little bit about that when we get to York. And Carlisle has arches that are badly warped because of the sagging of Saxon foundations that unwisely were relied upon. It's a nice question.
Can you hear me? This is really a comment, but I would welcome your response to it. It seems to me that the builders of the Sainte-Chapelle strove for illusion as well as everything else. As you look up, you have the impression that everything is carried on those slender cold piers. You have no sense that there are deep buttresses on either side of them. Of course, there are no flying buttresses here, but the buttresses stood out from the exterior quite a long way, and yet, when you're inside looking up, you have no sense that there's all that stone there.
That's quite a nice comment, Henry. That is indeed true. It's true to a somewhat lesser extent in the other buildings we've talked about. You don't, at Amiens, get a sense of the fires. They, of course, are not visible from the interior. But yes, at La Sainte-Chapelle, it is indeed an illusion. We don't sense, as you said, we don't sense the guts of the thing that are working pretty hard. Yeah, quite true. Quite true.
Can you say a word about Maison Livre and Freemasonry?
Can I say a word about it?
What's the relation with Freemason and Maison Livre?
I only know that that was the term used for what was the sculptor, we would call them sculptor, in the lodge. But they were a part of the lodge's team. They were not a separate profession. When the master mason contracted to build the building, he contracted to build the whole thing, and that included the sculptural work. Beyond that, I don't know the details.
So the later organization of Freemasonry was something that Mozart was interested in.
Yes, yeah. It became, I think, something quite different over time.
This is kind of a baby question, but,
Wait a minute, this side.
oh, sorry.
You keep mentioning the word England. Are you using that term loosely or specifically?
England, am I using it loosely or specifically? The sites we're talking about are England, not Scotland, or they're not the British Isles. No, they're England.
But what about Wales?
What about Wales?
Wales.
Wales is England. Oh, yes, indeed. Pardon me?
Isn't it in Wales?
Oh, no, Wales is in Somerset.
Okay.
Oh, Wales is southeast of Bath. They are actually the same bishopric, Bishop of Bath and Wells.
Okay.
Yeah, no, Wells.
What
is-
about Carlisle? You just
Carlisle is England up near Hadrian's Wall, well north, way north. Yeah.
No, it's actually in Scotland.
Carlisle?
Yeah.
Oh, you have me there.
So you are meaning England when you say
Yes,
England.
yes, I am.
You're not going to step outside of that. Is that because there are no Gothic things outside of England? In Wales or Scotland? Or Northern Ireland?
I don't know of any, no. There's the northernmost of the Gothic, and I'm not sure you're right about Carlisle, but Carlisle is more Romanesque than Gothic. The failure there is in Romanesque arches. What is the northernmost? York Minster we'll be talking about.
What about Glasgow? The cathedral in Glasgow?
No, I'm not aware of a Gothic cathedral in Glasgow. Am I missing something?
Well,
I'll take a look.
okay.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
Maybe take a look.
Yeah. And there are things in Scotland that fascinate me, Macintosh's work, and the Queen's Ferry Bridge, which I think is a magnificent piece of work, the fourth bridge, and much in Edinburgh, but I'm not aware of a Gothic cathedral there. I'll take a look.
The passage between Ireland and Scotland and England, there's a constant movement of things and people across that passage.
She's talking about the exchange of people between Scotland and Ireland and England, which is quite true. I know Ireland more in its recent history than its medieval one, but and England has a good bit to answer for in that relationship. But yeah, that we're moving adrift, I think.
Okay.
I have a kind of baby question. Having played with blocks with my children, I'm just wondering what keeps the whole thing from falling apart and tumbling down. Are there dowels, or how are the stones connected each to the next?
Strictly surface-to-surface bedding.
Really?
In the construction of Greek work, there are typically metal cramps, as they're called, that lock the pieces together. That is not true of the Gothic. There is no metal work involved that I'm aware of at any site. Reims, when it was so terribly destroyed, showed no metal connections between the blocks at all. They're simply bedded with a thin wash of mortar to ensure an intimate bedding, and that's the game. I don't know, there may be metal work in this, that's possible, but I know of no example that has been identified. I will show you when we get to Salisbury, that wretched building, that we have the framing and the spire, but it's all wood, there's no metal work. Yeah.
I have
Do you have
another
any
question.
questions on this side?
I'm curious about the glass.
Yeah.
Could you speak more about that? Was it built on, these windows constructed on site? And of course, over the course of centuries, which is what much of the construction of these buildings involved, do they keep the glass consistent in design?
I know less about the glass than I should. Because Malcolm Miller was such an expert in it, I yielded, and I know more about its light characteristics, its effect on the spaces, than I do about its details. I know about the displaced cames that I should have talked to you about Bourges today. There the H of the cames is displaced and of different dimension, which yields an inability of the eye to clearly focus. It's a fascinating piece of work. And I know some of the windows at Chartres, but relatively few specifically. The Virgin and Child is a famous one in the choir outer aisle. But I can't tell you a great deal about it beyond that. Much of what we know about the construction of these buildings is in part because the glaziers portrayed many of the trades in the windows. At Chartres, I think the laying of the masonry and much else is in the glass. But again, I am no expert, and I'm sorry to have to say that, but it's quite true. I value their effect on the spaces, but my orientation has been more that than the liturgical details, at least.
I
Yeah.
think we have time for a couple more questions.
Sure we do. We have time. Whatever we need is fine. Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
If this is a stone question, I think you said it was at Saint-Denis, and it was, they had these kind of a striped effect on the light-colored stone columns, and I wondered if it was built in 1250 or whenever it was built, and was it like that when it was built? Do you know? Is it beautiful?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Oh, it's a pattern in the way that the stone is put together, striped, pretty much.
Right.
Never mind, no big deal.
I'm sorry not to follow your question. You know,
Maybe there's a question over here.
Whatever. I'm glad to stay for whatever you want to talk about.
How about over here? Well, looks like you've answered everyone's questions. It's been a wonderful lecture, and thank you so much.